The pumps that saved New Orleans from the swamp are the same machines that have been sinking it for 130 years. This city sits up to 15 feet below sea level, not because of natural geology, because of a single engineering decision made in 1895. Most people who visit never realize the streets they walk on are lower than the river sailing past their rooftops. The draining of the swamp didn't fix the problem. It created a slower, permanent one. New Orleans was founded in 1718 on a site every rational engineer would have rejected. Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville chose a narrow strip of natural levee between the Mississippi River and Lake Pontchartrain. It was the only ground slightly above water for miles in any direction. The French colonial engineer Adrien de Pouget designed the original street grid of the French Quarter in 1722. On land sitting roughly 1 to 3 feet above sea level, that was the high ground. That was the best available option. French colonial officials in Paris explicitly warned Bienville the site was unsuitable. He ignored them. The river location was strategically irreplaceable for controlling North American trade, and that was the end of the argument. By the early 1800s, the city had expanded beyond the natural levee into the back swamp. This was a vast cypress swamp, sitting at or below sea level, flooding seasonally, making entire neighborhoods uninhabitable for months each year. Picture this. Stand at the levee on the edge of the French Quarter and look toward the river. The water is above your eye level. Behind you, the city descends. You are standing at the geographic peak of New Orleans. The Mississippi River at New Orleans runs approximately 15 to 20 feet above the surrounding city, contained only by artificial levees. Cargo ships sailing the river are physically higher than the rooftops of houses a few blocks inland. This is not a metaphor. This is the daily geometry of the place. The river that gave the city its reason for existence also sits above it like a weight. What most visitors never realize is that the oldest part of New Orleans is also its highest and safest ground. The French Quarter, built in 1722, sits on natural levee. The wealthiest, most developed modern neighborhoods to the north and west sit 10 to 15 feet lower, because they were built on what was once swamp. For 170 years, the back swamp sat largely untouched behind that natural levee. Seasonally flooded, seasonally dry, home to cypress trees and standing water and the permanent sounds of a subtropical wetland. Then, in 1896, the city decided the swamp had to go. The newly created Sewerage and Water Board of New Orleans began the first systematic attempt to drain the back swamp using centrifugal pumps and a network of drainage canals. Nothing on this scale had ever been attempted in a below-sea-level city anywhere in the world. The initial pumps were inadequate. The swamp kept returning. New Orleans receives over 60 inches of rain per year, and the subtropical climate does not negotiate. The water always came back. Albert Baldwin Wood was a New Orleans-born engineer employed by the Sewerage and Water Board. In 1913, he designed a new type of screw pump capable of moving up to 50,000 gallons of water per minute per unit. That number had no precedent in civil engineering. Wood's pump was so effective that the Netherlands adopted it. Egypt adopted it. The United States Army Corps of Engineers adopted it. Wood received international recognition and remained almost completely unknown to the general public. Step inside the Palmetto Pump Station, built in 1915. The turbines are the size of small buildings. The sound is a low, continuous roar that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. They have not stopped since Woodrow Wilson was president. Wood never left New Orleans. He spent his entire career at the Sewerage and Water Board, turned down offers from other cities and countries, and died in 1956, having personally overseen the system he designed for over 40 years. His pump worked exactly as designed. The water left, and then something began happening beneath the newly dry ground that no one had fully accounted for. The backswamp soil beneath New Orleans consists primarily of organic peat and clay. This material is structurally stable only when saturated with water. The water pressure inside the soil is what holds it up. When the drainage pumps removed the groundwater, the pressure inside the peat dropped. The organic material began to oxidize and compress under its own weight. Engineers call this consolidation subsidence. The soil was collapsing inward, slowly, continuously, with no mechanism to reverse it. Peat soil can lose 30 to 60% of its original volume when fully drained and oxidized. In New Orleans, this was not a theoretical risk. It was measurable within years of the pump's beginning. Operation. United States Geological Survey benchmarks installed across New Orleans in the early 20th century showed consistent downward movement in drained neighborhoods. In some areas, the ground was sinking at a rate of 1 to 3 centimeters per year through the middle of the century. Think about what you would see. Drive from the French Quarter northwest toward Lake Pontchartrain. Watch the elevation reading on any mapping application. In 3 miles, you will descend approximately 10 to 12 feet below your starting point, passing through land that was open swamp 100 years ago. The areas of New Orleans that were never drained have subsided the least. The French Quarter natural levee ground remains closest to its original elevation. The areas developed after 1920 on former swamp now sit 8 to 15 feet below sea level. The soil was stable for thousands of years underwater. The act of removing the water to make the land livable destroyed the structural integrity of the land itself. The subsidence did not stay invisible for long. Within 2 decades of drainage, it became physically apparent in the streets, the houses, and the relationship between them. In multiple New Orleans neighborhoods, streets run along the top of drainage canal levees and sit noticeably higher than the front doors of adjacent houses. The road is the high point. The residential lots slope downward away from it on both sides. This is not a design choice. When these houses were built in the 1920s and 1930s, the street grade and the house foundations were at the same level. The houses sank. The streets, built on more stable fill material over the drainage canal levees, sank less. The differential was measurable within 20 to 30 years of construction. Houses built flush with the street grade in 1925 were visibly below street level by 1950. The city responded by periodically raising street grades to compensate. Imagine approaching from the river at Lakeview in 1930, then again in 1960. The house is the same, the door is the same, but the street outside has become a raised ridge, and the yard has become a bowl. Every time a street was repaved and raised, the adjacent houses appeared to sink further by comparison. The infrastructure meant to connect the city physically rose above the homes it was designed to reach. New Orleans has some of the worst road infrastructure in the United States, not primarily because of underfunding, but because roads built on subsiding soil crack, buckle, and separate from utilities constantly. The repair is perpetual because the sinking is perpetual. What was emerging was not simply a maintenance problem. It was a closed loop with no exit. As neighborhoods sank lower below sea level, the hydrostatic pressure of groundwater pushing up against the city increased. The pumps had to work harder to maintain the same drainage effect they had produced a decade earlier. The Sewerage and Water Board expanded pump capacity repeatedly through the 20th century, not to drain new land, to compensate for the increased water pressure caused by the subsidence that earlier pumping had produced. A 1984 engineering study commissioned by the city found that New Orleans required approximately 3 times the pump capacity per acre that it had needed in 1920. The city was so much deeper below sea level that the same volume of pumping accomplished less. The drainage canals themselves became a structural problem. Their walls were under permanent pressure from surrounding groundwater. Subsidence caused them to crack and leak. Maintaining the canals required resources that the canal's own existence had made necessary. The city built a machine to escape its geography. The machine made the geography permanently worse. The city became permanently dependent on the machine. Today, the Sewerage and Water Board operates 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, using pump designs descended directly from Wood's original 1913 specifications. A 48-hour pump failure during heavy rain is the modeled threshold for significant flooding across multiple neighborhoods. Some of Wood's original 1913 screw pump units remain physically operational in New Orleans pump stations today. Replacement parts are custom machined because no standard industrial components fit them. The board has described them as functionally irreplaceable, without a full station rebuild costing hundreds of millions of dollars. The loop had no exit, but for decades, the city chose to believe it did, and it filled the drained swamp with houses and called it progress. Between 1915 and 1930, the newly drained back swamp neighborhoods of Gentilly, Lakeview, and Mid-City were subdivided and sold. The prices were far below those of the French Quarter or Uptown, making them accessible to working-class and middle-class buyers who could not afford the higher natural levy ground. Developers described the land as reclaimed. That word implied permanence and improvement. Sales materials made no mention of subsidence, groundwater pressure, or the engineering dependency the buyers were inheriting along with their lots. The neighborhoods built on former swamp developed their own street culture, their own architecture, their own identity over 3 generations. By 2005, Lakeview and Gentilly had been residential for 80 years, long enough for the swamp origin to be completely invisible in lived memory. Close your eyes for a moment. A Lakeview street in 1965. Oak trees, front porches, the sound of a neighborhood in the middle of a weekday. The same coordinates in 1905. Open cypress swamp, standing water, no ground to stand on. The transformation took 15 years. The forgetting took 1 generation. A 1960 United States Geological Survey elevation study showed that Lakeview had by then subsided to an average of 6 to 8 feet below sea level, lower than at any point in its geological history, still sinking faster than the older uptown neighborhoods because the peat soil there was younger in its drainage history and still in active consolidation. The Gentilly neighborhood was almost entirely undeveloped cypress swamp as recently as 1910. 3 generations of families lived their entire lives on land that had been underwater within living memory. Most had no idea. The neighborhoods that felt most permanent and established were built on the most geologically unstable ground. The swamp had been forgotten precisely because the drainage had worked so well. When Hurricane Katrina made landfall in August 2005, it activated a century of accumulated geological debt. Post-Katrina flood analysis by the United States Geological Survey and the Army Corps of Engineers showed a near-perfect correlation between neighborhood elevation and flood depth. Areas that flooded deepest corresponded almost exactly to former backswamp land drained in the 20th century. The French Quarter received minimal flooding despite being geographically central and surrounded by flooded areas. It sits 3 to 5 feet above sea level. It was built on the original natural levee and had never been drained swamp. Lakeview, one of the most severely flooded neighborhoods, sits on former swamp drained between 1915 and 1925. At the point of the Katrina flooding, much of Lakeview was 6 to 8 feet below sea level, entirely as a result of 90 years of drainage-caused subsidence. The levee failures that flooded the city were not uniform. They failed primarily along drainage canal walls in the drained backswamp areas, the same canals whose construction and maintenance had been structurally compromised by decades of surrounding subsidence. A 2006 study funded by the National Science Foundation concluded that without the 20th century drainage-caused subsidence, Katrina flood levels in the worst affected neighborhoods would have been 3 to 5 feet lower. That difference, in many cases, was the difference between first-floor flooding and total structural loss. The lower Ninth Ward, globally recognized as the most devastated area, was itself built on reclaimed swamp. The industrial canal levee that failed and flooded it was constructed through former wetland, and its foundations had been subsiding for decades before the storm arrived. Katrina did not cause the flooding through weather alone. The storm activated what the ground had been doing continuously since 1896. After Katrina, engineers said openly what the geological data had been showing for decades, and the question of what to do next had no clean answer, because there is no clean answer. The Sewerage and Water Board of New Orleans currently operates 24 pump stations containing 120 pumps, moving water through 90 miles of drainage canals. The system consumes approximately 20 megawatts of electricity continuously, every hour of every day, just to keep the existing city above its own groundwater. Think about what you would have seen standing in a New Orleans pump station at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday in January. No storm, no emergency, just the turbines turning, the water moving, the city staying dry for one more night. The same as every night since 1913. The post-Katrina flood protection system, completed in 2011 at a cost of $14.5 billion, protects against storm surge at a scale the original 1896 engineers could not have imagined. The city is safer from external flooding than at any point in its history, and it is also deeper below sea level than at any point in its history. GPS monitoring as of the 2000s shows ongoing subsidence rates of 1 to 10 millimeters per year in former swamp neighborhoods, slower than the 20th century peak. Not zero. Not reversible. In August 2017, a moderate rainfall event overwhelmed the New Orleans pump system. Not a hurricane, a rainstorm. Several large pumps were offline for maintenance, and streets in mid-city and other neighborhoods flooded in conditions that would have been routine in any other city. The incident revealed the actual margin between functional and flooded New Orleans. It is measured in individual machines. Some urban planners and geographers have proposed managed retreat from the lowest-lying former swamp neighborhoods, essentially acknowledging that certain areas cannot be made permanently safe. As of 2024, no official managed retreat policy has been adopted. The city continues to maintain, repair, and expand infrastructure on ground that is lower today than it was yesterday. The Palmetto and DeLarge pump stations, enormous brick structures built between 1913 and 1915, still stand in New Orleans today. Their turbines run without pause. They can be visited as working monuments to the decision that made the city's present geography permanent and irreversible. A city did not flood because of a hurricane. It flooded because of a pump, built in 1913, still running now, doing exactly what it was designed to do. The ground beneath New Orleans is lower today than it was yesterday, and lower than it will be tomorrow. The machines that keep the city alive are the same machines that are, slowly and without malice, pulling it below the surface of the earth.